There is a small, pretty park on a grassy slope above the ocean in Manhattan Beach, California. People jog up its steps in the morning for the workout and the view. Families spread out on the lawn. From the top terrace, you can see the whole shining sweep of the Pacific. It is one of the nicest little parks in one of the wealthiest beach towns in America, and almost everyone who enjoys it has no idea what is buried underneath the grass. This ground was stolen, not lost, not sold, stolen, taken from a black family by the city itself, using the law as the weapon 100 years ago in an act the city of Manhattan Beach has now formally admitted was driven by racism. They took a thriving black beach resort and the homes of the black families who had gathered around it, and they drove those people out, and they called it a public park. And then this is the detail that gives the whole thing away. They didn't build the park. Not for 30 years. The stolen land just sat there empty, because a park was never really the point. Getting rid of the black people was the point. But this is the one story we will ever tell you that does not end in the graveyard of everything that was lost, because 100 years after the city stole this beach, something happened here that had never happened before in the entire history of the United States of America. The land was given back, returned, the actual deed, the actual oceanfront ground, handed to the descendants of the family it was taken from. The first time this country ever did such a thing. And then those descendants did something that turned a century-old wound into $20 million. This is the story of Bruce's Beach. It is a story about how you steal a paradise. And it is the only story we know that is also about how, against every expectation, a country finally tried to give one back. It starts with a woman who said out loud in 1912 exactly what was about to be taken from her. Her name was Willa Bruce, and she and her husband Charles were part of the same great current that carried millions of black Americans out of the segregated South and toward the promise of the West, the Great Migration. The Bruces had made their way from the east and then out from Albuquerque, New Mexico, arriving in Southern California around 1912 with their son, Harvey. Charles Bruce had a good, steady job for a black man of that era. He worked as a Pullman porter, serving passengers on the railroad dining cars, a job that paid decent wages and let him see the whole country. But it kept him away, riding the rails. So it was Willa who would build the thing that made them famous, because Willa Bruce looked at the California coast and she saw both a dream and a wall. The dream was the ocean, that endless, beautiful Pacific shoreline that drew everyone west. The wall was that almost none of it was open to people who looked like her. This was the era of Jim Crow, and it did not stop at the Mississippi River. All up and down the California coast, the beaches, the resorts, the bathhouses, the piers, they were, by custom and by force, for white people only. A black family that drove to the shore for a day in the sun was, in most places, turned away, harassed, or worse. There were only a tiny handful of stretches of sand in all of Southern California where a black person could stand in the surf without being run off, a section of Santa Monica Beach they called the Inkwell, a pier here, a club there. That was it. Hundreds of miles of coastline, and a black family had almost nowhere to put down a towel. Willa Bruce decided to change that. In February of 1912, she bought a lot of land right on the Strand in Manhattan Beach, a beachfront property for $1,225. And when a Los Angeles newspaper asked her about it, she said a sentence that you need to carry with you through this entire story, because everything that follows is contained inside it. She said, "Wherever we have tried to buy land for a beach resort, we have been refused, but I own this land, and I am going to keep it. I own this land, and I am going to keep it." Hold that. Because Willa Bruce was right about the first part, and the entire machinery of a city was about to prove her wrong about the second. She started small, a portable cottage on the sand, renting out bathing suits, selling refreshments, offering changing tents and a place to rest to black beachgoers who had been turned away everywhere else, and it caught on immediately because the need was so enormous. So the Bruce's built. By 1913, there was a real building, Bruce's Lodge. Over the next few years, it grew into a genuine resort, a cafe and restaurant, a dance hall, changing rooms, showers, a place to eat and dance and stay the night. By 1916, the place that everyone was calling Bruce's Beach had become a thriving, beloved fixture, a joyful, humming seaside destination for black families from all over Los Angeles and far beyond. Photographs from the 1920s show them arriving by the truckload, young women in bathing suits piled into the back of a wagon for the ride down to the water, laughing. For thousands of black Angelenos, Bruce's Beach was the one place on the entire Southern California coast where they could do the simplest, most human thing in the world, feel the ocean on their skin, without a single white hand pushing them away. And it grew into more than one family's resort because there was a land developer in the area named George Peck, who, for the time, was a genuine maverick. He broke with the standard practice of refusing to sell to black buyers, and he sold lots near Bruce's Beach to black families. And they came. A whole small community began to form on those blocks by the ocean. Major George Priolo and his wife Ethel, Elizabeth Patterson, Mary Sanders, Milton and Anna Johnson, John McCaskill and Elzia Irvin, James and Lula Slaughter, who opened a large boarding house to house the black visitors who wanted to stay the weekend. It was a modest, hopeful, growing thing, a little black beach colony on the California coast built around Willa Bruce's Lodge, a foothold, a future. The white residents of Manhattan Beach hated it, and from almost the very beginning they set out to destroy it. Manhattan Beach in those years was a small, overwhelmingly white town that had only just incorporated. And to many of its white residents, the sight of black families enjoying the ocean, owning property, building a business, laughing in the surf on their beach was intolerable. So they began a campaign of harassment that started with cruelty and escalated over the years into something much darker. They put up fake signs restricting parking near Bruce's Beach to 10 minutes so that black visitors had nowhere to leave their cars. They roped off routes to the water and told black beachgoers they were trespassing if they crossed private land to reach the public sand, even though the sand belonged to everyone. They made the simple act of walking to the ocean into a legal trap, and then the trap started snapping shut on real people. On the 4th of July, 1927, a young woman named Elizabeth Catley, a UCLA student who was a guest at the Slaughter's boarding house, was arrested for trespassing on a white neighbor's land and hauled off to jail wearing nothing but her bathing suit. 2 weeks later, 4 black swimmers, a doctor named H.C. Hudson, along with John McCaskill, J.H. Conley, and Romelius Johnson, were arrested and charged with trespassing on beachfront land. They were put on trial in Manhattan Beach City Hall, found guilty, and each fined $100, a serious sum in 1927, for the crime of trying to reach the ocean. But the harassment did not stop at fake signs and trumped-up arrests, because the Ku Klux Klan came to Manhattan Beach. The Klan targeted the Slaughter family, who ran the boarding house, and they tried to set the Slaughter's home on fire. They burned a cross near the family's property. That unmistakable, terrifying signature of American racial terror planted in the sand by the Pacific Ocean. The message to every black family on that stretch of beach could not have been clearer: you are not safe here. Leave. And by 1930, under the relentless pressure, the Slaughters had lost their land too. The white residents of Manhattan Beach had tried vandalism. They had tried intimidation. They had tried arrests and fake signs and the fire and the cross, and Willa and Charles Bruce were still there, still running their resort, still holding the deed to the land Willa had promised she would keep. The harassment alone was not going to move them. So the city reached for a bigger weapon. It reached for the law. In 1924, prompted by a petition from local white real estate agents and other citizens who wanted the black families gone, the Manhattan, as the beach city government voted to condemn Bruce's beach and the surrounding blocks, the Bruce's resort, and the homes of the other black families, and to seize all of it through the power of eminent domain. Now, eminent domain is a real and sometimes legitimate government power, the state's right to take private property for a genuine public use, like a road or a school, as long as it pays the owner fair compensation. And the city of Manhattan Beach knew it needed a public use to justify the taking. So they announced one. They said they needed the land, this specific land, the black-owned land, for a public park. And here is the fact that exposes the entire thing as a lie. There was already another site set aside for a park. A larger, more central piece of ground had been designated for exactly that purpose. The city did not need the Bruce's beachfront for a park. It had a park site already. It targeted the Bruce's land and the land of the Prioleaus and the Pattersons and the Johnsons for one reason and one reason only, because black people owned it and the city wanted them gone. The park was a costume. Eminent domain was the knife. The Bruces fought. God, how they fought. They challenged the condemnation in court. They spent, by the account of their own descendants, most of the fortune they had built up over more than a decade of running that resort, and spent it on lawyers, on the legal battle to keep the land Willa had sworn to keep, and they lost. In 1929, the court validated the city's claim. The city offered the family $14,500 for the beachfront empire they had built from a cottage on the sand, far less than it was worth, far less than the Bruces believed they were owed. And to make sure the family could never simply move down the coast and start again, the city council took one more vicious step. It voted to block any new resort from opening, specifically to prevent the Bruces from relocating their business. They didn't just take the beach. They made certain the Bruces could never build another one. In 1927, Willa and Charles Bruce left Manhattan Beach. They moved to Los Angeles, and the city tore down the two-story clubhouse that had been the heart of Bruce's Beach, demolished the dream while the final dollar figures were still being argued in court. Now watch what the city did with the land it had just destroyed a black family to obtain. The land it swore it needed for a public park. Nothing. For decades, absolutely nothing. The stolen beachfront sat empty, vacant, undeveloped. The park that had been the whole legal justification for the theft was not built in 1925 or 1930 or 1935 or 1940. The city of Manhattan Beach did not get around to building a park on the land it had seized until 1956, nearly 30 years after it drove the Bruces out. 30 years the land sat idle, a silent, weed-grown confession that the emergency public need for a park had never been real. If the city had truly needed that specific ground for a park, it would have built one. It didn't need the ground. It needed the black people off of it. And once they were gone, the park could wait a generation because it had already served its only true purpose. The human cost of that theft is almost unbearable to lay out because it fell on two people who had done nothing but build something beautiful. The city did not even pay the Bruces their settlement money until 1932. And by 1932, it was already too late for the man it was owed to. Charles Bruce had died in 1931, a year before the check arrived. Willa Bruce died 2 years after that in 1934. They spent the last years of their lives having watched their life's work condemned, demolished, and taken, having burned through the fortune they'd built trying to save it, and having been barred from ever rebuilding it anywhere in that city. According to the family, they were devastated by what had been done to them, and they rarely spoke of it afterward. It was too painful. The trauma of it, one descendant said, the terrorism they had suffered at the hands of the Klan and the city council both, was something the family carried in near silence for generations. A scar, another descendant called it, financial and emotional, passed down through the bloodline like an inheritance of loss. And that is the part that no park bench and no ocean view can ever fully undo. Because think about what was actually stolen. It was not just a resort, it was a dynasty. Willa and Charles Bruce owned prime California beachfront property in 1912, land that a century later would be worth tens of millions of dollars. Had it stayed in the family, it would have thrown off wealth for generation after generation. It would have paid for college educations and homes and businesses and a launching pad for great-grandchildren who hadn't even been born yet. That is what generational wealth is. The ground beneath the family's feet that lifts each new generation a little higher than the last. The city of Manhattan Beach did not just take a beach from Willa and Charles Bruce. It reached forward in time and robbed their great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren of a fortune those children would never know they were supposed to have. The theft didn't end in 1924. It kept stealing quietly for 100 years. And for most of that 100 years, the story was simply buried. The land sat empty, and then it became a park, and the park was pleasant, and it was passed between governments, from the city of Manhattan Beach to the state of California to Los Angeles County, which acquired it in 1995 with the legal restriction that it be kept for public recreation and never sold. People walked their dogs on it. Nobody who mattered remembered or wanted to remember whose beach it had been. For a long time, the park didn't even carry the Bruce's name. It was only in 2007 that Manhattan Beach's first black city council member and mayor, a man named Mitch Ward, led the effort to rename it Bruce's Beach. And even then, the little plaque they installed failed to tell the real ugly full story of what had happened on that ground. And it might have stayed buried forever, except for the summer of 2020, because in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, as a national reckoning with racial injustice swept the country, people in Manhattan Beach and across Los Angeles began to look again at that pretty little park by the ocean and to ask what had really happened there. A Manhattan Beach resident and activist named Kayvon Ward founded a movement she called Justice for Bruce's Beach. On Juneteenth of 2020, she organized an event at the park to drag the true story back into the light and to demand something almost no one had ever seriously demanded before. Not an apology, not a plaque, but the land itself. Give it back. And this time, the demand landed on people with the power to answer it. Los Angeles County supervisors, Janice Hahn and Holly Mitchell, took up the cause. A real estate attorney named George Fatheree took on the family's case, working through the fantastically complicated legal knot of how you even return the government land that a century of transfers and restrictions had locked away. The core problem was that legal restriction requiring the county to keep the land for public use, which made it impossible to simply hand it over. So they went to the state of California, and the state legislature did something extraordinary. It passed a law, Senate Bill 796, written for this exact purpose, to lift the restriction and clear the path for the land to go home. In September of 2021, Governor Gavin Newsom signed it. Then came the detective work, because to return the land, the county had to prove exactly who Willa and Charles Bruce's living heirs were across 100 years of a family that had scattered and rarely spoke of its stolen birthright. Forensic genealogists were hired. They traced the bloodline down through the generations until they found them. Marcus and Derek Bruce, the great-grandsons of Willa and Charles, the rightful heirs to the beach their ancestors had been driven off of a century before. And on a summer day in the 2022, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to return the two oceanfront parcels of Bruce's Beach to the Bruce family. It had never happened before. In the entire history of the United States, a country built in no small part on land taken from black and indigenous people over and over for 400 years, no government had ever formally returned seized land to the black descendants of the family it was stolen from. Bruce's Beach was the first. The deed to that shining piece of California coastline, the ground Willa Bruce had bought in 1912 and sworn she would keep, was placed back into the hands of her descendants. What one activist called a 100-year journey to justice had impossibly arrived. And then the family did the thing that completed the circle. In January of 2023, the Bruce descendants made their decision about the land they had just been given back. They chose to sell it to Los Angeles County, which needed the parcels for its lifeguard operation, for $20 million. $20 million, finally paid 100 years late to the blood of the woman who bought a beach for $1,200 and promised she would keep it. The generational wealth that the city of Manhattan Beach had reached across the century to steal was at last restored, not to Willa and Charles, who could never be reached now, but to the family they had left behind. The scar, in the only way a scar like that can ever be addressed, was finally acknowledged and finally paid. So how do you sit with a story like this, like a story that is a theft and a resurrection at the same time? You have to hold both halves because both are true and neither one cancels the other. On one side, the return of Bruce's Beach is a genuine, historic, precedent-shattering act of justice. It proves something that America had never proven before, that stolen land can go home, that the descendants of the robbed can be made whole, that a wrong buried for a century is not necessarily buried forever. It lit a fire. Kayvon Ward went on to build a national organization pushing to return stolen land to black families all over the country, from California to Texas. And Bruce's Beach became the model, the case everyone points to, the proof that it can actually be done. That is real. That matters. That is hope, with a deed attached to it. But on the other side, you cannot let the happy ending erase the price, because justice came 100 years too late for the two people who were actually owed it. Willa Bruce died in 1934, broken and nearly silent, having spent her fortune fighting a city that beat her with the Klan on one flank and the courtroom on the other. Charles Bruce died a year before the city even paid the pitiful settlement. They never saw the ocean given back. They never held the $20 million. They went to their graves believing their dream had been destroyed for good, because in their lifetimes it had been. The great-grandsons who were finally made whole in 2022 never met the great-grandparents who were robbed. You cannot give a stolen century back to the people who lived it. The years the Bruces spent grieving, the wealth their children grew up without, the whole alternate life that was taken from an entire family line. No check can reach into the past and undo that. $20 million is justice. It is also a receipt for something that should never have had a price. So walk up those steps in that pretty park above the ocean and stand on the top terrace and look out at the Pacific that Willa Bruce fought so hard to give her people access to. This is the ground she bought. This is the ground they burned a cross beside to frighten her neighbors off. This is the ground the city stole and called a park and then left empty for 30 years to hide the lie. And this is the ground that 100 years later became the first piece of stolen land America ever handed back to the black family it belonged to. Willa Bruce said it in 1912. I own this land, and I am going to keep it. She was wrong in her own lifetime by every cruel measure the city of Manhattan Beach could bring to bear. She did not get to keep it. They took it, and it killed the dream, and very nearly the family with it. But she was not wrong forever. It took 100 years and a movement and a law written just for her, and a country finally willing to look at what it had done. Her great-grandsons kept it long enough to be made whole. long enough to prove Willa Bruce right, a century after they told her she was wrong. And the beach where all of it happened is still there. The sand, the surf, the grassy slope, the whole shining sweep of the Pacific she wanted her people to be free to love. It remembers everything. And now, at last, so does the country that tried to make it forget.